When you hear the name Florence Nightingale, what's the first thing that, instantly pops into your head?
Hmm.
For most of us, I think it's that classic image, right? It feels like it's been ripped straight out of some Victorian drama.
The lamp.
Oh, the lamp, exactly. A slender, quiet figure, lamp in hand, and she's gliding along these long rows of sick and wounded men in a military hospital, probably in the middle of the night.
Yeah, that's the one. The lady with the lamp. It's been the defining narrative for, what, over 150 years now?
It has, and it's an incredibly powerful narrative. It speaks to her compassion, it really does.
It does, but it's also a bit of a problem. Because if we only focus on that single soft light from the lamp, we completely miss the huge, blinding searchlight she's shown on everything else.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, on institutional failure, on statistical neglect, on the absolute failure of public health infrastructure at the time. It kind of reduces her from this radical intellectual, a genuine statistical powerhouse and a systemic reformer, into just a kind caregiver.
Right. It makes her seem passive when she was anything but.
Exactly. So our mission today on the deep dive is to quickly but really thoroughly unpack the real Florence Nightingale.
We want to move past that myth of the compassionate nurse to explore the woman who, used mathematics and relentless political pressure to completely transform global health outcomes.
We've pulled together every facet of her life, really, from her privileged birth in 1820 in Tuscany through to her foundational statistical work, her revolutionary achievements in public health, and her really complex, sometimes challenging social and theological views, all the way to her death in 1910.
This is a deep dive for you if you want that comprehensive knowledge, but absorbed quickly.
And it's not just about nursing history, is it? It's really about tracing the founder of modern data-driven professional knowledge work. She was someone who realized that to change the world, you first have to measure it.
Wait, hold on. So the lady with the lamp was actually a data scientist?
In a way, yes,
Okay.
a pioneering one.
How did she even get that level of rigorous intellectual training in, 1840s England? I mean, a time when women of her class were essentially meant to be ornamental.
Well, that's where we have to start. That's the story we need to unpack.
Okay, let's get into it.
We absolutely have to start with that unique intellectual foundation because it was a direct result of this incredible privilege combined with some incredibly unconventional parenting for the time.
So she was born into a very wealthy family with deep social connections. May 12, 1820, specifically at the Villa Colombaia in Florence, which was then the Grand Duchy of Tuscany.
Right, and she was named after the city of her birth, Florence.
Just like her older sister, Frances Parthenope, was named after the Greek settlement near Naples where she was born. That's a nice detail.
It is. The family moved back to England a year later, and the girls were raised across their two large estates, one in Hampshire and one in Derbyshire.
But what's really important here is the family atmosphere, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. They were deeply liberal humanitarian, which really set the moral stage for her later calling. Her maternal grandfather, a man named William Smith, was a highly notable abolitionist and a Unitarian.
And Unitarians were a nonconformist religious group known for, intellectual rigor and a real focus on social reform.
Precisely. But the real game changer, the person who made it all possible, was her father, William Edward Nightingale.
He had these progressive, almost radical ideas about women's education.
Which was just almost unheard of for a woman of her social status at the time. Florence and her sister didn't just learn embroidery, they received what was essentially a classical gentleman's education, all at home.
What did that include?
They studied history, Italian, classical literature, philosophy, and, critically for her story, mathematics.
And her father taught her himself.
He did. For a woman from that stratum of society, that was completely revolutionary. I mean, advanced mathematics was considered entirely unnecessary for a woman. Some even thought it was, detrimental to a woman's delicate sensibilities.
But Florence took to it. The sources all make it very clear that she was the more academic of the two girls and showed this profound, innate ability for collecting and analyzing data from a very early age.
That rigorous, almost exclusively masculine curriculum of the time equipped her with a tool data analysis that she would later, quite literally, weaponize to save thousands of lives.
So this elite, yet deeply liberal and analytical background, it must have made the traditional, restrictive Victorian life seem
fundamentally unbearable for her. She was intellectually active, she was constantly reading, and then in 1837, at their home Embley Park, she experienced the first of several events that she interpreted as clear calls from God.
Calls to do what, specifically?
To service,
Mhm.
specifically to serve the poor and the suffering. And that calling immediately put her into direct conflict with her entire family and really her entire society.
Because she simply could not accept the expected role.
No, she couldn't just become an affluent wife and a mother. It wasn't in her.
And the main resistance to this calling came through courtship, didn't it?
It did. She faced a very persistent courtship for 9 years from a politician and poet named Richard Monckton Milnes.
This was a good match, by all accounts. Socially approved, financially sound, politically advantageous, everything her family wanted for her.
And yet she resisted for almost a decade. She wrote about it, saying she was convinced that marriage would interfere with her ability to follow her calling to nursing, a calling she believed required total dedication and, crucially, autonomy.
You really have to pause and just reflect on the immense social courage that must have taken.
Oh, absolutely.
Rejecting a highly desirable match like that meant she was actively choosing to be marginalized within her own class structure. She was risking becoming a spinster, totally dependent on her family's good graces.
And it's not like she was rejecting Mills because she hated him. She was rejecting the institution of marriage because she saw it as a cage for her ambitions.
The frustration from her family must have been immense.
It was. She pursued this self-education in the field of nursing against what's documented as the anger and distress of her mother and sister. They saw nursing as something akin to domestic servitude, performed by working-class women.
Hardly a fit occupation for a gentlewoman.
Exactly. She was challenging the social code at its very foundation.
And this path of self-education, of sort of striking out on her own, it brought her into contact with some really key figures who shaped her intellectual freedom, didn't it?
Yes, a few very important people. First, there was Mary Clark, who she called Clarky. She was a Parisian hostess she met in 1838.
And what was she like?
Clarky was, by all accounts, highly eccentric, very stimulating, and she openly despised the intellectual limitations placed on upper-class British women. She famously regarded them as inconsequential.
I read she even claimed she'd choose the freedom of being a galley slave over being an upper-class British woman.
She did, which gives you a real sense of her radical perspective. But she made this massive exception for Florence. Clarky showed her that women could and should be intellectual equals to men.
That's an idea Florence probably hadn't fully internalized from her own mother, despite all the schooling from her father.
I think that's right. And they remained close intellectual friends for 40 years. Clarky provided this affirmation that Florence's intellect wasn't some strange quirk, but a legitimate, powerful instrument.
Then there was Sidney Herbert.
Yes, the politician she met in Rome in 1847. He was on his honeymoon, actually.
And he was the Secretary at War at the time.
He was. And this was arguably the most politically important relationship of her life. They became lifelong friends, and Herbert was instrumental in facilitating her entire mission to the Crimea because he held the office necessary to authorize her deployment.
Their friendship was highly productive, but also incredibly demanding on him, wasn't it?
Very. She became Herbert's chief advisor on military organization and political matters throughout his career. Some historians even suggest that the intense pressure of her relentless reform program was a significant factor that contributed to the acceleration of his death from Bright's disease in 1861.
Wow. So she demanded action, regardless of the personal cost to her political allies.
She was ruthless in her pursuit of reform.
So she has the intellectual background, the political connections, but where did she get the practical training?
That finally came in Germany. In 1850, she visited the Lutheran religious community at Kaiserswerth am Rhein. There, she observed Pastor Theodor Fleidner and the deaconesses.
And this was the first place she saw
Considered this experience a fundamental turning point. She received 4 months of medical training there, and her anonymous findings from this visit, a pamphlet titled The Institution of Kaiserswerth on the Rhine, actually became her first published work in 1851.
So she's already moving from just passive observation to active analysis and documentation.
Right from the start.
Yeah.
And by 1853, she was applying this education. She took the post of superintendent at the Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in London.
And critically, she was financed by an annual income of £500 from her father.
That's a key point. That money allowed her the luxury of pursuing a demanding professional career without needing to rely on a salary or a husband. She had the financial autonomy to be a professional.
Okay, so let's just recap. We have a woman with an elite mathematical education, deep social connections, powerful political allies, her own financial autonomy, and 4 months of cutting-edge practical training in Germany.
all against the backdrop of this overwhelming sense of religious duty.
Right. It's this unique combination that prepared her perfectly for the catastrophe that was about to unfold on the Crimean Peninsula.
Here's where her intellectual foundation met the brute reality of war.
So the Crimean War breaks out Britain and France against Russia, and as the conflict escalates, these reports start flooding back to the British public.
Yeah, reports about the truly horrific, chaotic, and disorganized conditions for the wounded soldiers, specifically at the military hospital housed in the Selimi barracks in Scutari, which is just across the water from Constantinople.
This public outrage creates the perfect political opening for Sidney Herbert, who was, again, serving as Secretary at War.
He was. And so on October 21st, 1854, Nightingale and a staff of 38 women volunteer nurses, which notably included 15 Catholic nuns, were dispatched to the Crimea.
And when she arrived in early November 1854, what did they find?
They were confronted by complete and utter systemic failure. There was shocking indifference from the existing military command. You had short supplies of medicines, overworked, and totally demoralized staff. But here's the devastating revelation. The thing had changed everything for her. 10 times more soldiers died from preventable illnesses, like typhus, typhoid, cholera, and dysentery, than from their actual battle wounds.
10 times more.
10 times. The military was effectively killing its own men far more efficiently than the Russian enemy was.
That is a staggering failure rate. So initially, Nightingale believed the cause was straightforward logistics, poor nutrition, not enough bandages, lack of supplies.
Right, that was her first assumption. But she was very quickly corrected by the reality on the ground. The true catastrophe was entirely sanitary.
What does that mean exactly?
It means gross overcrowding, defective sewers that were literally running beneath the floor of the barracks, and virtually zero ventilation. The air itself was poisonous.
And this is where the timeline of the official response is so crucial for understanding her later political tactics. The government was slow to respond.
Incredibly slow. It was only after Nightingale herself sent a desperate, direct plea to the Times newspaper, bypassing all official channels entirely, that the British government finally dispatched a sanitary commission.
And they arrived in Scutari in March of 1855.
Exactly, a full 6 months after she got there.
So what did this sanitary commission actually do? They didn't administer new medicines or perform surgery, did they?
No, nothing like that. They were engineers, not doctors. They flushed out the defective sewers, they improved the ventilation systems, and they removed mountains of stagnant waste.
And the result?
Death rates plummeted immediately.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this experience had to be the ultimate aha moment for her.
It was everything. She never actually claimed credit for the reduced death rate herself. She correctly attributed it to the Sanitary Commission's engineering work. But she realized in that moment that the vast majority of soldiers were being killed by poor living conditions, not by inadequate bedside care or battlefield injuries.
So her focus shifted permanently.
Permanently. From the individual patient to the system that surrounds them. That realization drove her entire later career, which was dedicated to large-scale sanitary reform.
And yet, despite all this political and statistical reformer is remembered for that soft, sentimental image. Which brings us back to the origin of the legend.
Indeed. The nickname, the Lady with the Lamp, came from a dispatch in the Times by William Russell, who was the main war correspondent.
He described her slender form, gliding quietly along the corridors at night with a small lamp.
Yeah, and this fed a public that was just hungry for a virtuous, compassionate, feminine narrative. It was later immortalized in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1857 poem, Santa Filomena.
It's the perfect Victorian image of feminine sacrifice. But Russell had to ignore a much more interesting and probably more accurate nickname to promote that one, didn't he?
He did. The troops, the men who actually saw her operate every day, they initially called her the Lady with the Hammer.
The hammer, why?
Because she literally, physically used a hammer to break into locked storage areas to get vital medicine, linen, and supplies when bureaucratic officials refused her access.
So she wasn't asking nicely.
She was not asking nicely. She was demanding resources and taking them if necessary. But William Russell, finding that kind of aggressive behavior unladylike, promoted the lamp instead.
That tension, the soft icon versus the ruthless administrator, was a consistent theme, wasn't it? And it seems especially visible in her highly fraught relationship with the other famous nurse of the Crimea, Mary Seacole.
A very frosty relationship is how it's often described. Mary Seacole was a Jamaican nurse who financed and ran her own establishment, a kind of hotel and hospital for officers, miles away and much closer to the battlefront.
Seacole's own memoir records a friendly enough meeting where Nightingale gave her a bed in Scutari while she was on her way to the front, so there was some professional respect there.
There was, initially. However, Seacole also inferred that racism was the reason for her rejection when one of Nightingale's colleagues rebuffed her attempts to join the official government-sanctioned nursing group.
And Seacole was an independent entrepreneur operating completely outside of that official bureaucracy.
Right, and Nightingale's private letters confirmed her professional apprehension, even if they don't explicitly confirm racism. She wrote expressing worry about any professional association between her official, government-backed work and Seacole's private business.
Why? What were her specific concerns?
She claimed Seacole's establishment introduced much drunkenness and improper conduct among the men because it also functioned as a kind of officer's mess with a bar. She wrote to her brother-in-law, and I'm quoting here, "I had the greatest difficulty in repelling Mrs. Seacole's advances and in preventing association between her and my nurses. Absolutely out of the question."
So this highlights a really crucial conflict. It's the official government-backed model, which is focused on discipline and long-term reform, versus the independent entrepreneurial model that was perhaps more immediate but lacked the long-term systemic control Nightingale craved.
And this raises a really important question about how history selects its heroes, doesn't it? Why was Nightingale chosen as the singular face of the Crimean nursing effort?
I suppose it boils down to state sponsorship.
I think so. Nightingale's work was official, it was backed by the Secretary at War, and crucially, it was focused on gathering the data that could be used to force massive governmental reform later on.
Whereas Seacole's work, while deeply compassionate and immediate, just lacked that political leverage.
Exactly. History often favors the narrative that leads to systemic, official change. It's interesting to contrast that with the strong, lasting professional bonds she formed with other groups, like the Irish nun Mary Clare Moore.
She led the first wave of the Sisters of Mercy to Scutari.
She did, and she immediately placed her entire group under Nightingale's strict autonomous authority. The second wave of nuns, led by a different woman, Mary Frances Bridgman, refused to give up their administrative independence.
And they were met with a much cooler, less productive reception from Nightingale.
Much cooler. Nightingale demanded control because she knew that systemic reform, which was always her true goal, required absolute centralized data collection and policy implementation.
The experiences at Scutari, then, they convinced Nightingale that the key to saving lives wasn't just compassion, it was empirical evidence.
Yes, she had the mathematical education from her father, and now she had the data set, the horrific death tolls of the Crimean War, to prove her point.
So let's pivot fully now to Florence Nightingale, the pioneer statistician. She had this huge problem. She had to present complex, overwhelming data to an audience, the British Parliament, the civil service, who were, let's be honest, largely illiterate when it came to statistical tables.
They were. She needed to make the horror of the situation visible and immediately understandable.
And this is what drove her pioneering work in the visual presentation of information. She wasn't just collecting data, she was innovating how data was communicated.
This is where she is famous for her usage of the polar area diagram, which she herself called a coxcomb or a rose diagram.
We really need to spend a moment explaining this because it's the physical manifestation of her genius.
Yeah.
What exactly is a coxcomb and why on earth was it so effective?
Okay, so imagine a standard pie chart. But instead of the different slices radiating from the center like a pizza, where the angle of the slice tells you the proportion,
Right.
in a coxcomb, the slices are all the same angle. Each slice represents a fixed period of time, say 1 month of the war.
Okay, so you have 12 slices for a year.
Exactly. And then the radius, so the distance of the slice from the center, is then varied to represent the magnitude of the data point.
So if 50 people died in January, the slice for January would be short. But if 500 people died in February, the slice for February would jut out dramatically from the center.
Precisely. What this creates is this powerful, immediately intuitive visual effect, where the area of the wedge, not just its length or its angle, conveys the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe.
And in her famous 1858 report on the war, she used this to devastating effect.
She did. The coxcomb sections representing deaths from preventable diseases, The blue wedges for typhus, cholera, dysentery were geometrically enormous. They just visually dwarfed the tiny little red and black sections that represented deaths from battlefield wounds.
That is pragmatism just weaponized. She was forcing members of parliament who, let's be honest, probably didn't want to read a 300-page report on military hospital sewage,
Probably not.
to visually confront the fact that poor organization was a much more lethal enemy than the entire Russian army.
Precisely. She made extensive use of these coxcombs to present her reports. They didn't have to read the complex footnotes. They saw the geometric truth in a single glance.
And this work was recognized, wasn't it, by the highest professional statistical bodies. This confirmed her status was well beyond just nursing.
It did. In 1859, Nightingale was elected the first female member of the Royal Statistical Society.
The first woman ever.
Ever. And the recognition was global. In 1874, she became an honorary member of the American Statistical Association. She had successfully transitioned from nurse to a globally recognized statistical authority because she proved again and again that her data led directly to quantifiable life-saving reforms.
And after the Crimea, her attention quickly shifted to the catastrophic health conditions of the British Army in India.
Which she rightly saw as just an extension of the exact same organizational problem she had fixed at Scutari, but on a much, much larger scale.
She applied the same rigorous analysis, right? Demonstrating statistically that the high death rates among soldiers there were caused by familiar systemic sanitary failures.
Same old story. Bad drainage, contaminated water supplies, gross overcrowding in barracks, and poor ventilation. But she also expanded her focus, arguing that the health of the British Army in India could not be separated from the health of the people of India as a whole.
This required a massive political effort. She had to lobby for a royal commission into the Indian situation.
Which she did, successfully. It ran for 5 years, from 1858 to 1863. And that reform period that followed provided the ultimate validation for her data-driven approach.
The results were definitive, weren't they? And she made sure they were widely publicized.
Oh, yes. After 10 years of intensive sanitary reform, by 1873, Nightingale was able to report that mortality among soldiers in India had declined dramatically from a staggering 69 per 1,000
69.
down to just 18 per 1,000. It was a complete triumph of applied statistics, engineering, and infrastructure, not necessarily new medical breakthroughs.
So then her expertise came home to Britain, and this culminates in one of the most significant pieces of public health legislation in history.
Her Crimean War statistics convinced her absolutely that non-medical approaches, clean water, effective drainage, ventilation were the single most effective public health intervention possible at that time.
And she saw an opening during the Royal Sanitary Commission of 1868-1869.
She was relentless. She combined forces with the established sanitary reformer Edwin Chadwick, and together they lobbied the responsible minister, a man named James Stansfeld, to strengthen the proposed public health bill.
And she insisted on two really radical points. First, compulsory sanitation in private houses.
Meaning property owners couldn't just ignore the problem anymore.
And second, and this is where her political brilliance really shines, she insisted on devolving enforcement powers to local authorities.
This decentralized approach was pure genius. It eliminated the political logjam of central government and, the central medical technocrats trying to micromanage every single town and village.
By forcing local authorities to enforce connection to Maine's drainage and sanitation standards, she ensured accountability at the lowest, most practical level.
And this resulted in the landmark Public Health Acts of 1874 and 1875. These acts codified her vision. They required property owners to pay for connection to the Maine's drainage network, and they put the power of enforcement into local hands.
And here's the fact that should just stop you in your tracks: the astounding historical reality of what this achieved.
It's incredible. Historians credit this focus on drainage and decentralized enforcement Nightingale's core strategy, with playing a central role in increasing the average national life expectancy by an incredible 20 years between 1871 and the mid-1930s.
20 years.
20 years.
That's monumental. We are talking about adding 2 full decades to the average lifespan of an entire nation.
And this happened before antibiotics, before widespread vaccination, and before modern surgical techniques could touch the deadliest epidemic diseases like cholera and typhus.
So her legacy is literally etched into the longevity of the British population.
Absolutely. Her greatest achievement wasn't comforting a dying soldier in Scutari with a lamp. It was implementing infrastructure reform based on data she visualized that saved millions of lives for generations to come. It proves that sometimes the greatest healers are not doctors, but engineers, statisticians, and reformers.
So While she was busy statistically reforming the nation's entire infrastructure, she was also somehow simultaneously founding an entirely new, respected profession.
The sheer scale of her ambition is just staggering, isn't it?
It really is. So after the war, the Nightingale Fund was established. It raised a remarkable £45,000 from public subscriptions to recognize her efforts.
And she used that money not for personal gain, of course, but to establish the first secular nursing school in the world. The Nightingale Training School at St. Thomas's Hospital in London in 1860.
Which is now part of King's College London.
It is. And this was such a necessary and urgent correction to the public image of nursing at the time.
Before Nightingale, the stereotype of a nurse was that incompetent, negligent, alcoholic, and corrupt Sarah Gamp character from Charles Dickens's popular novel Martin Chuzzlewit.
And according to the Florence Nightingale Museum, that caricature was often only a mild exaggeration. Nursing was frequently a job of last resort for poor, uneducated women and often involved excessive drinking on the job.
Nightingale transformed nursing from this disreputable, unskilled occupation into a respectable professional field.
Defined by rigorous training, discipline, and very high moral standards.
And her standard for care was detailed in her foundational text, Notes on Nursing, which was published in 1859.
Yes, and while she initially wrote it for people nursing their relatives at home, it quickly became the cornerstone of her school's professional curriculum.
The book made a really crucial intellectual distinction, didn't it? She separated sanitary knowledge, or what she called the knowledge of nursing, from medical knowledge.
Yes, medical knowledge, she argued, was for doctors. Nursing knowledge was about ensuring the patient's environment, clean air, clean water, quiet, proper diet, was put in a state where the body could recover from disease naturally.
It was knowledge that, in her words, everyone ought to have.
Precisely. That distinction gave nursing its own intellectual foundation, separate from just assisting a doctor. It elevated it to its own science, focused on the environment of care.
And one of her most significant, yet maybe least celebrated achievements was taking this new professional standard and applying it to the most marginalized populations in the country.
You're talking about her work in the workhouse system.
Exactly. She introduced properly trained Nightingale nurses into the British workhouses from the 1860s onwards.
That is huge. Before this, the standard of care in a workhouse was, well, it was abysmal.
Sick paupers were literally being cared for by other, often elderly or infirm, able-bodied paupers, people who were in the workhouse because they couldn't work themselves.
Zero professional training, zero hygiene, zero accountability. By introducing Nightingale nurses, she brought professionalism, discipline, and, crucially, sanitation to the bedsides of the poorest citizens. It was a profound application of her moral calling.
This brings us to a frequently discussed complexity in her work. Her initial stance on germ theory. She's sometimes accused of denying it entirely, which seems really odd given her empirical, data-driven focus.
It's an issue of historical context and being precise with the terminology. The sources clarify she was specifically opposed to contagionism.
Okay, what was contagionism?
It was the prevailing medical theory at the time that disease spread only by physical touch or very close proximity to a sick person.
And why did she oppose that?
Because it just didn't align with her data from Scutari. At Scutari, diseases were spreading like wildfire through the barracks, even among people who didn't directly interact with the sick. She observed that foul air, what they called miasma's defective sewers, and overcrowding were the primary vectors.
So if she had focused only on contagionism, on touch, she would have completely ignored the sanitary environment.
Which she had already proven was the true killer. She was pragmatically choosing the theory that best fit the mass mortality data she had collected, rather than the prevailing medical theory of the day.
That makes sense.
And it's crucial to remember that before Pasteur and Lister's experiments in the mid-1860s definitively proved germ theory, very few medical practitioners took it seriously anyway.
But her stance evolved with the evidence, didn't it?
Oh yes, she was always empirical. By the early 1880s, she wrote an article advocating for strict precautions explicitly designed, and she stated this, to kill germs. If the data changed, her operational approach changed too.
Her entire system, based on sanitation and clean environments, proved incredibly influential, transcending borders.
It did. It directly inspired the organization of the volunteer U.S. Sanitary Commission during the American Civil War.
Okay, so now we have to address the really complex and often contradictory nature of her views on women and the burgeoning women's rights movement of her era.
Yes. She was undoubtedly a feminist by her actions, but she often explicitly rejected the feminist ideology of her peers.
How can a woman who created a profession that liberated thousands of women from domestic servitude simultaneously reject the movement for women's liberation?
I think it stems from her intense pragmatism and her deep frustration with the passive lifestyle of women of her own class.
So on the one hand, she criticized the early women's rights activists for complaining about the lack of careers for women.
Right, at the exact same time that she found lucrative medical positions under her own supervision were perpetually unfilled. In her view, they were just talking when they should have been working.
She often preferred the friendship and collaboration of powerful men, didn't she? Insisting they were the ones who had done the heavy lifting to help her attain her goals.
She did. She once wrote a very stark assessment. I have never found one woman who has altered her life by one iota for me or my opinions.
Wow, that's a harsh judgment.
It is, and she even referred to herself in her correspondence using masculine terms. She would explicitly call herself a man of action and a man of business.
So this was her way of defining herself against what she perceived as the weakness and passivity of traditional femininity.
I think so. But here's the great irony. This fierce, almost anti-feminine self-definition ironically produced one of the most powerful foundational texts of English feminism.
You're talking about Cassandra.
Cassandra, which she wrote between 1850 and 1852. It is a blistering critique of the over-feminization of women into near helplessness.
It's a profound essay. It analyzes the paralyzing emotional and intellectual frustration experienced by intelligent, educated women who were trapped by the restrictive, lethargic lifestyle of the Victorian drawing room.
A lifestyle she observed daily in her own mother and sister. The essay is titled Cassandra because she feared her warning that society was suffocating women's intellectual energy would go tragically unheeded, just like the warnings of the Greek prophetess.
And that work is now considered a key link in the chain of feminist thought. It connects the earlier writings of Mary Wollstonecraft to the later, more famous explorations of female identity by Virginia Woolf.
It captured the stifled rage of an entire generation of intellectual women.
So she was just deeply complex. She rejected the ideology of feminism when she descended into complaint without action, but she was fundamentally driven by the desire to free women from that drawing room cage.
And this internal contradiction, it finally resolved itself on the political front later in her life.
Even though she preferred working with powerful men, she eventually recognized the need for true political equality.
She did. She was convinced by the social reformer Josephine Butler that women's enfranchisement suffrage was, and I'm quoting her, absolutely essential to a nation if moral and social progress is to be made.
A figure of action to the end. She realized that to create lasting political change, women needed the ballot.
From 1857 onward, Nightingale's demanding pace and her exposure to disease in the Crimea really caught up with her.
She became intermittently bedridden, likely suffering from brucellosis and an associated condition, spondylitis. Though her symptoms did begin to ease somewhat in the 1880s, but this did not signal the end of her influence.
Far from it. She remained phenomenally productive in social reform. She essentially became a power broker and an intellectual center, all run from her home.
And she continued her pioneering work in the field of hospital planning and architecture, didn't she? Corresponding ceaselessly.
Yes, she understood that if you could design a hospital with adequate ventilation, clean water sources, and proper drainage built in from the start, you could reduce the mortality rate before a single nurse even started work.
Her designs, all based on functional data, propagated across Britain, the United States, and India.
Her contributions were recognized by the highest levels of the British establishment, even in her later semi-recluse years. She was the very first recipient of the Royal Red Cross in 1883, which is a military decoration.
And then in 1907, a massive honor. She became the first woman to be awarded the Order of Merit,
which is an order granted personally by the sovereign and is limited to only 24 living members at any one time. The following year, she was given the honorary freedom of the City of London.
It really speaks volumes that the nation treated her not just as a compassionate figure, but as a genuine national architect of policy.
She died peacefully in her sleep at age 90 on August 13, 1910, and tellingly, she declined the offer of a state funeral and burial in Westminster Abbey, the resting place of kings and heroes.
She chose instead to be buried simply in East Wellow, Hampshire, near her family home.
She always preferred quiet service over public pomp.
Her institutional memory, however, is anything but quiet. It is enshrined globally and professionally. You have the Nightingale Pledge, a modified version of the Hippocratic Oath, created in 1893 and still recited by new U.S. nurses today.
International Nurses Day is celebrated on her birthday, May 12th, every single year. And the International Committee of the Red Cross awards the Florence Nightingale Medal every 2 years, which is the highest international distinction a nurse can achieve.
And her legacy found this direct, immediate, and extremely relevant modern resonance during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. When England required massive temporary critical care expansion, the emergency facilities they set up were named NHS Nightingale hospitals.
This connected her history of emergency sanitary reform and her ability to organize care under crisis directly to the 21st century's greatest health crisis.
She was also a constant presence in the British public consciousness for decades. Her image appeared on the reverse of the Bank of England 10-pound banknotes from 1975 to 1994.
Which made her the only non-monarch woman on British paper currency prior to 2002.
And perhaps most fascinating of all, a piece of her actual voice was preserved. A recording on a wax cylinder was made in 1890 to raise money for veterans of the Charge of the Light Brigade.
So her voice, that quiet, firm voice of the administrative reformer, perpetuated her great work long after her death.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize the whole story? We've traced the narrative arc from the privileged, uniquely educated daughter through the horrific crucible of the Crimea to the reality of the mathematical social reformer.
Her greatest legacy lies not in sentiment, but in professionalism, statistical rigor, and large-scale public health engineering that dramatically shifted national longevity.
We see the truly radical sustainable change so often requires technical expertise. Her mastery of statistics and data visualization, paired with that initial unshakable moral conviction that drove her out of the drawing room and into the professional world.
She didn't just care. She measured, she mapped, and she forced change.
And this leads us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over. Because that profound moral conviction was rooted in a very personal, very radical, and often heterodox view of religion.
She was a Unitarian, but she went even further, didn't she?
She did. She believed in the concept of universal reconciliation, the idea that all souls, even those who die without being conventionally saved, will eventually reach heaven. This was a radical theological stance for her time, opposed to the prevailing Calvinist dogma of eternal punishment.
So this profound sense of boundless universal mercy, it fundamentally fueled her demanding pursuit of earthly good.
Exactly. She was freed from the burden of worrying about who would go to hell. This allowed her to focus entirely on eliminating earthly suffering through empirical means.
There's an anecdote where she comforted a dying young prostitute who was distraught over fearing hell.
Yes, and Nightingale, the stern reformer, told her that the real God is far more merciful than any human creature ever was or can ever imagine, reassuring her that she was already more merciful than the punitive God she feared.
So her conviction that God was infinitely merciful freed her to concentrate totally on empirical, practical reform and sanitation, rather than worrying about saving souls through restrictive dogma.
Just think about that for a moment. Think about how such a radical spiritual conviction could fuel such immense practical, empirical, data-driven work.
Yeah.
That's a powerful idea to mull over.